everyone, today I'm going to begin my series of cosplay worklogs for my Princess Zelda costume from Breath of the Wild. My Twilight Princess Zelda was one of my favorite costumes I had ever done, but when Breath of the Wild came out, I was probably one of like 3 people who were disappointed that Zelda's main design had pants. I wasn't a big fan of her white dress either, but luckily in like 2 cutscenes she's shown to have this blue dress, and it's very similar to her regular standard blue tunic look, being upscaled and more real to make her look like a real princess. So to start off the series, I'm going to be talking about the 2 pieces of her costume that can be easily transferred to her standard blue tunic look, which is her white quilted shirt and blue bodice. So to start off, I don't really have a lot of footage of when I made the white underlayer of Zelda's dress, but I'm going to just show you the 2 pictures I have and then talk a little bit over that. So I decided to make this as a fully separate shirt as opposed to try and piece it alongside the blue overdress. I wasn't really worried about this making the costume too hot, as the cons I foresaw myself wearing it to are both in the winter, so the added layers are actually going to be helpful in staying warm. I decided to use a bodysuit pattern that was designed for stretch knit fabrics, and I cut off the pattern where the leg holes would be at the waist and then added a seam allowance to the bottom edge. I started that way I was going to do all the embroidered details on her chest and stomach with a quilted satin stitch with a layer of quilted batting sandwiched between 2 layers of fabric. When designing the pattern, I made a paper copy of the front and back that I drew the quilted design onto. I gathered as many reference photos as I could of seeing what the pattern looked like from a bunch of different angles to make it look as accurate as possible. For quilting, the batting on the front of the shirt is like a full-size piece that matches the front pattern, but for the back, I only cut a section of batting that covers her lower back, as that's the only part that's shown to have the embroidery, and I wanted the upper back to remain free and stretchy for when I put in the zipper. I drew on the design with a water-soluble quilting pencil, and if you're doing this on a darker colored fabric, I would definitely recommend getting chalk because I think it shows up better. After I drew out half of the design, I flipped it over and then traced it onto the second half, checking and measuring the distance of all the parts of the designs to make sure that they're symmetrical. When they were all drawn out, I put pins on the ends of the lines to mark my starting and ending locations for when I started sewing. When it comes to quilting, you have to get it right the first time because you can't seam rip out the satin stitch on knits without destroying the fabric. I went slow and carefully tug on the knit to keep it from bunching up. I would obviously do a test watch to see how the satin stitch is going to look before you end up doing the final version. For the lines for the side seams that go across, I waited until the front and back were completely sewn together to make these lines because I wanted to make sure they would look even across the seam. Next, I worked on the collar. So this is 2 layers of knit that I didn't think would be sturdy enough, so I added a bit of fusible interfacing designed for knit fabric on one of the inner layers. Mine got a bit jacked up in the front when the 2 halves met, but I think it's such a small issue and it actually didn't really turn out too bad. The zipper was also a bit of an adventure to make, and I'm wondering now what a full back of the batting would have done to stabilize the jersey when sewing the zipper in, but since it's at the very back of my neck and that's covered by the wig and the other outer blue dress, I can't really worry about it too much. The next step was to make a bias casing for the bottom edge instead of a hem. I used 2 different tutorials that I'm going to attach here because they explain it a lot better than I ever could. It was at this point that I realized that having sleeves is really non-essential, and I had to make gloves anyway for like the hand parts, so I decided to make them just as 2 long gloves. I used James Mansfield's tutorial for stretchy gloves, and I made them out of the same fabric of the shirt. The tutorial is pretty straightforward. The only thing that I had to change was the fact that Zelda's gloves are fingerless, so I made them into regular gloves and then ended up cutting off the ends of the fingers afterwards. So the blue of Zelda's dress is actually more of a top and a skirt that I guess are theoretically all one piece if you include like the white quilted top, but again, I'm making them all as 3 separate pieces. So for the top, I decided to make a mock-up using this pattern as a base, and once I had it sewn together and on top of my shirt, I could see how much alterations I had to do. The shirt is actually really quite short, only hitting her underbust, as really very low cut considering how large the quilting is. With the quilted shirt as a guideline, I decided to cut and add to my mock-up to better match the shape of her top. The general construction of the top is really easy. The area that was quite an adventure was to make all of the gold applique that goes across her chest, sleeves, and the trim of her skirt. For the chest alone, there were 7 separate zones that I had to draft pattern pieces for. I'm going to insert a picture here of how I broke it up. All of the appliques were first attached using fusible webbing and then satin stitched around the edges. For the chest appliques, there was a specific order I followed to make sure everything would fit together nicely. So I did the collar details, then the side boob area, then the center chest area, and at this point I attached the collar onto the rest of the shirt. I attached it using a French seam, which I will show in this separate video. So the way that you do French seams is you pin it wrong sides together, and it basically looks the exact opposite of how you want to, because you'll have this big raw edge on the outer side. But then what you do is you trim that seam and then turn it inside, and then it will form a little casing for where the raw edge will go. And it's really good to do this around collars because it makes it have a really clean edge. Then I have the free hanging chest pieces that are the random gold strips that sort of go over the quilted layer. And they're done as pieces of bias tape so they won't have an exposed raw edge. Then there's the nape of the neck collar trim, also done in bias tape. The outer collar trim, which is also done in bias tape, and then the armhole area, which I did after I had the sleeves attached. At the point where I had done all of the appliques, I then switched to making her belt, which I did as a waistband that's attached to the top. The belt is actually a different color than the top, but I just decided to use the wrong side of my dress fabric. I then made a thick satin stitch to make the squiggle that goes around the middle, and put beads in the places of the dots that are in the original design to make it look a bit more fancy. And our central belt buckle is made of 2 layers of craft foam covered in thibra with a pin glued on the back. So for the sleeves, I actually had to draft a new lower sleeve piece given how large hers are, and I actually had to do this twice because I made a full set of sleeves originally and they were just way too thin and short for my liking. So I started over, and with this new lower sleeve, I added an inch seam allowance to having to sew not only to a lining but also to having the sides be sewn together as well. So I needed the total final length to match up with the circumference of the upper sleeve. And as you can see, I fell short a little bit, but it's actually going to be fine because she actually has armbands that cover up this area anyway, so it's better to have a little too little than to have too much and have it overlapping. So those were the steps I took to make most of the top of Zelda's outfit. It was a lot more difficult than I'm making it sound, and it took me quite a while to figure everything out. A lot of it was just patterning out all the appliques and having them lay in the right position and not look too gross. I would really say to do appliques wherever you can before you sew everything together. The chest was all done after I'd sewn the base, since the appliques sort of go over multiple seams, but that's okay. And for the sleeves and the skirt, I did them while the pieces were still unsewn, and it makes the life a million times easier when you can sort of hide the back with the lining. Another thing that I would really suggest is that I would not use a stretch fabric for the underlayer because with the batting, it sort of stabilizes it and makes it lose most of its stretch anyway. So I actually had to add a couple extra inches in my back pattern so that I could get it off easily. And I did have that stretch from the upper back, but it will definitely be a lot easier if you just do it out of regular fabric and then have like a more larger zipper to get it on and off. I would also say that's good to do as much planning as you can before you launch onto an area that you're not really sure about how you're going to do, but also don't overthink it. Just make sure that you're taking into consideration all the aspects of the design. And most importantly is to always have reference photos on hand so you can make sure and go back and check that you're doing everything as accurate as possible. So thank you guys so much for watching. I think the next part in the series will probably be doing all of the armor pieces for Zelda. So I hope you'll continue watching, and I'll see you all then. Bye.